Hello everyone. Today I will be presenting our work called Neural Architecture Search using Progressive Evolution. My presentation will have 5 parts. I will start with giving a brief introduction, then I will discuss about the architecture representation, then what was the motivation behind this work, and then I will discuss the method, and finally I will present the concluding remarks. So, what is a neural architecture search problem? It is basically designing an algorithm that will automatically search an architecture. So any neural architecture search algorithm has 3 parts. So the first part is the search space. The next part is what kind of method are we using to perform the architecture search. Finally, how are we measuring the performance of an architecture. So any given data set has 2 sets. One is training set, another one is the test set. So you would divide the training set into 2 sets. One becomes the training set and the second one becomes the validation set. So in order to evaluate a specific architecture, you would first train it on the training set and then evaluate it on the validation set. So the performance of the architecture in the validation set becomes the fitness of that architecture. But this becomes the bottleneck part of any neural architecture search because you have to train each architecture from scratch. So now I will discuss how we are representing the architecture in the search space. So this is the search space of a CNN architecture, and our objective is to design an algorithm that will search for the architecture of the normal cell and the reduction cell. So the difference between reduction cell and the normal cell is that the reduction cell will reduce the spatial dimension, whereas the normal cell will maintain the spatial dimension. So how do we represent the normal cell or the reduction cell? So this is an example of a normal cell which is composed of 4 nodes, and the different colored arrows represents the different operations that can be applied between 2 different nodes. To represent an architecture in the search space, we use the supernet. The supernet is basically a supergraph that contains all the architectures in the search space as a subgraph. The reason why we chose supernet for our problem is because supernet solves the bottleneck part because it all the architectures in the search space shares the parameter, so we don't have to train each architecture separately from scratch. If we just train the supernet, we get the value of the fitness value of the architecture in the search space. So now to represent an architecture in the search space, we use an architecture parameter called alpha, which is basically a 2D matrix. So to look closely in the architecture parameter alpha, the columns represents the operations in the search space. Here for illustration, we have considered 3 operations in the search space, and the rows in the matrix represents the edges between the 2 nodes. The entries in the matrix represents the weights given to an operation. For example, let's look at the entry alpha 0, 1. This represents the edge between the node 0 and 1, and the entries represents the weights given to the 3 operations in the search space. So if we look at the edges between those 2 nodes in the supernet, we see 3 arrows with different colors representing the 3 operations in the search space, and the thickness of the arrow represents the weights associated with that operation. Clearly, the red arrow has the largest thickness owing to the weight associated with operation 1. So, what was the motivation behind our work? Even though the supernet reduces the search time of the neural architecture search methods, it introduces a problem wherein the fitness estimated by the supernet is very noisy. But we observed that as we reduce the number of operations in the search space, which is basically reducing the search space, the predictive power of the supernet improves. This can be seen from the table here. which measures the correlation of the fitness estimated by the supernet versus the true fitness in terms of the candle tau. We observe that as we reduce the number of operations in the search space, the correlation value increases. Based on the previous observation, we propose to use the supernet to search for smaller promising search space within the bigger search space, instead of trying to get the best architecture within the search space using the supernet. For example, the figure shows a search space with 4 operations, and we use the supernet as shown here as S omega 4 to find a smaller search space with good architectures. Now we get a smaller search space with 3 operations with promising uh, architectures. So now we create again another smaller supernet and then use it again to reduce the search space further to 2 operations. So now in the smaller search space of 2 operation, we use the smallest supernet to find the best architecture in that search space, and we output the best architecture in the smallest search space as the output of the algorithm. So this is basically the whole process of pEvoNAS. Next I will discuss the whole process of our method. So let's say we have this search space with 4 operations and we create the supernet. The first part is basically training the supernet. To train the supernet, we use the stochastic gradient descent method, and for each training batch, we randomly sample the architecture parameter alpha from uniform distribution and update the architecture parameter in the supernet. Uh, we train the supernet for a specific number of epochs. So at the end, we get a trained supernet for that specific search space. Next, we use this trained supernet to find the smaller search space with promising architecture. This is done by using a genetic algorithm. The algorithm will first start with initializing the population. Next, we evaluate each individual in the population. This is done using the trained supernet that we already obtained. Based on the estimated fitness of the individuals in the population, we will now evolve the population to get the next generation population. We apply crossover operation and mutation operation to perform the evolution. So for crossover, we need 2 parents. So the parents are selected using the tournament selection, and from the newly created child using the crossover, we apply the mutation operation to get the resultant architecture. Next, we check if the stopping criteria is satisfied or not. If the criteria is not satisfied, then we repeat the process again. If the criteria is satisfied, then we move on to the next part, which is the search space reduction. Now, how do we perform this search space reduction? Let's say we want to reduce the search space from 4 operations to 3 operations. So for the newly smaller search space, we also have to create the smaller supernet. So how would we perform the search space reduction? For better visualization, let's say we want to reduce the search space from 3 operations to 2 operations. The way to do it would be to remove the operations with the lowest weight in each row as shown in the figure here. So after the search space reduction, how do we create the next supernet for the new smaller search space? First way would be to initialize the new smaller supernet with random weights. And the second way would be the new supernet inheriting the weights from the previously trained supernet. This would be called as the weight inheritance, and in our method we use the weight inheritance. So now we have finished the search space reduction and initialized the new supernet. We then check if the stopping criteria is satisfied or not. If not, we repeat the process again. If yes, then we return the best architecture in the selected search space. We apply our method to two different search spaces, S1 and S2. In S1, we search for both normal and reduction cells. And there are 8 different operations in the search space. We search the architecture on CFAR10. The results are given in terms of test accuracy, so higher the value, better it is. As is seen here on comparing to previous evolution-based method, our method outperforms them. This is achieved while using significantly less computational resources. We can see similar results when we apply our method to the CFAR 100 dataset as well. On transferring the searched architecture on CFAR 10 and CFAR 100 to the ImageNet dataset, we also get similar result where our method outperforms the previous evolution-based methods. Now, for the search space S2, we only search for the normal cell. And the number of operations considered here is 5. This reduces the size of the search space as compared to the previous search space S1. Here we search the architecture on CFAR 10, CFAR 100 and ImageNet 16120 dataset. The results are reported in terms of accuracy, so higher the value, the better it is. Here also our method outperforms other gradient-based methods. Here we check if our method can select promising regions within the search space. The x-axis represents all the architectures in the search space and the y-axis represents the true accuracy of the architecture. So, using our method, when we reduce the search space from 5 operations to 3, then 2 operations, we see that our method does select regions with good quality architectures. When we compare it to the random search, where the search space is reduced randomly, we see that the region selected contains both good and bad architectures. Finally, when we do not use the weight inheritance for the supernet, we see that the region selected is not a good quality one. This is shown as the orange dots in the figure. Finally, in conclusion, our paper proposes to use the supernet to search for promising regions within the architecture search space instead of trying to search for the best architecture in the search space. We achieve this using the trained supernet for search space reduction and also using the weight inheritance for initializing the supernet for the smaller search space. Our method performs the architecture search in search time which is significantly less than the previous evolutionary based methods.